And yeah, what a time to be talking about emotions and technology. And one of the places I want to get to today is to think about some of the ethical dimensions of all of this. So who am I? My name is Andrew McStay. I work at a university in Wales in the UK, Bangor University. And primarily what I do, I research the social impact of these technologies, focusing on emotion, affect-sensitive technologies, and indeed ethics. I have three key projects on the go at the moment. One, I'm looking at emotional AI in relation to UK and Japan, and it was an interesting place that I think we finished on in the last presentation in terms of thinking about kind of cross-cultural expressions and affect and emotion sensing. But for me, it's also interesting to think about the ethical dimensions of this. How are citizens receiving these technologies? What do they think? How do they feel? And how are they being deployed in these kind of different normative contexts? Second relevant project that I have on the go is in relation to children. And I think children, in many ways, are often unforgetting when it comes to these technologies. And that's both in terms of kind of the development and the deployment level, but also at a policy level as well. And certainly in Europe, yeah, there's nowhere near enough attention to children and the services they access. Third project, relevant project that I have on the go is indeed looking at COVID and mediated emotion. But this isn't going to be a COVID-based dissertation, but I do think the current situation helps us to highlight many of the issues that as scholars are working on the social side of these technologies. But just to give you the overview of the presentation, for one, while certainly emotions are personal, I think it's really important to recognize that they're equally social. Two, these technologies are in many ways really new, and some of the stuff that Daniel was sharing is really cutting edge. I think it's really important to realize as well is that these technologies have a history, indeed going back to the 1990s and the work at MIT, but even back to the 18th century as well. So I want to dwell a little bit on that. Yeah, now the modern versions of these technologies that we're interested in here, they really do raise amazing social opportunities, but they do raise concerns. And I think we need to flesh some of these out at this conference. And I think for those of you who are in the audience who are developers or kind of working on the kind of corporate side of all of this, I think there's certainly kind of ethical merit in getting these technologies right, but I think there's also self-interest as well. And the reason why that is because citizens genuinely do have some concerns. I'm going to end up talking about a little bit of kind of recent survey data that we've been collecting in the UK about citizen attitudes and perspectives on these technologies. So yeah, so one of the most interesting parts of the COVID experience has been about how we use technologies to manage what is broadly the mental health, relationships and connections. And we're doing this with our parents, we're doing this with our children, we're doing this with our friends, and indeed we're also doing it with ourselves as well. And I think when we think about what the COVID experience has been, certainly it's been epidemiological, but it has also been about managing the emotions of others. At a slightly more macro level, this is our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And again, his task, while not being in hospital and getting well, has been about managing populations. So I think this interest in kind of both measuring, gauging, understanding, reacting, feeding back, all of these issues that we're interested in here have kind of societal implications. Certainly outside of politics, within the commercial sector, again, they also, advertising businesses have also been kind of modulating the emotion of their campaigns in relation to citizen feedback. You can see kind of on the screen here that, there's been kind of different kind of camps, different types of emotive reactions in terms of kind of tangible help rather than kind of heavy branding, pure emotional support, and of course kind of business as usual messaging as well. But again, this need to gauge, respond, and influence, very much present in the COVID experience. Of course, others are getting a little bit weary of work, and parents, and socializing, collapsing into the Zoom portal. So where normally we would be in New York, Seth could advise where we might otherwise normally be. But of course, we're doing this through Zoom. Many of you will be taking calls with parents and possibly with children who live afar. So I think it's interesting, how our lives are kind of collapsing into the medium of Zoom. And of course, we're facing Zoom fatigue as well. And again, mediated empathy is a key issue here. One of the key reasons why we're getting so tired and fatigued through using Zoom is we're having to work so hard to read the faces, read the voices, try and work out what the bodily signals are, and to react appropriately. So simply the amount of effort and energy that we're putting into our Zoom calls is tiring us out. But then there's also the dark side of empathy as well. Empathy we normally think of as a good, as a positive, as a pro-social dimension. But if you've been unfortunate enough to be Zoom bombed, we can see that empathy has a dark side. And what I mean by this in relation to Zoom bombing is that Zoom bombers are quite literally kind of feeling forward and trying to kind of predict kind of how we will feel, and they're kind of launching these campaigns on the basis of how they suppose their attackers will feel. And what this is useful, helps us recognize, is that empathy and sympathy are really different things. But yeah, it's useful to go a little bit back to the future, to think about kind of some of the origins of these technologies and some of the origins of the thinking behind modern applications. So the quote that you see on screen here is from chapter 1 of a book that I wrote called Emotional AI, The Rise of Empathic Media. And I think one of the key observations here is that empathy is based on a much, much older idea about fellow feeling, and that we're constantly trying to work out the dispositions of others. And this feeling out is a constant of social life. So it gives you what I guess in philosophical jargon is an ontological dimension. Ontology simply means social reality. And I think, Daniel was kind of speaking to that point as well in terms of how we adapt to the speech of the other. So we're constantly feeling each other out. So again, kind of empathy and indeed emotion, these are certainly kind of personal things, but they're very, very much kind of a social activity as well. I think as well, in terms of kind of early uses of these technologies, you can look back at kind of Francis Edgeworth and kind of and his economic work on the hedonometer. And again, one of the things that this really, really early theoretical work on emotion and affect sensing to gauge happiness is one of the things that he gauged early on was this need for a greater number of measurements. So I find it really interesting that, many of us here will have kind of seen the work of kind of Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's kind of really kind of helped underline and point out the need to contextualize, be it facial expressions, be it affect sensing, whatever it may be. But this need for greater numbers of measurements through numerous observations, possibly with less perfect instruments. This is quite a modern understanding, but it goes back to 1881. And I think I urge you as well to have a look at the bottom of the screen for that wonderfully title of the book, Mathematical Psychics. I'm not sure anyone has come up with kind of such a cool title. So yeah, so in terms of kind of, in terms of kind of use of the hedonometer, one of the things that's kind of really interesting about this was this kind of utilitarian economic calculus of human emotion, i.e. to count what makes people happy. So the idea that we might have machines that might do this was not lost on British Victorians. But again, in other places, whereas the hedonometer was theoretical work, it was theoretical calculus, in terms of Wilhelm Wundt's labs in Germany around kind of the 1880s, again, developing technologies to sense attention and indeed to track emotion as well. So again, this is all the way back to the 1880s. And I find it really interesting, that when we think about modern affective computing, emotional AI, empathic technologies, we tend to associate this with consumer psychology. Technology was in fact at the beginning of consumer psychology. And I find that quite an interesting premise. So many of you will also be familiar with Duchenne. And I think one of the things, there's a few things that really capture my attention about this image. One is the date highlighted with the pink arrow, 1876. It's a really long time ago. But again, also the use of new media technologies as well. So we see parallels, not just in relation to the development of facts and facial actual coding systems and the taxonomy of facial expressions that Duchenne tracked, but again, also the use of new media technologies, the use of electrodes, the use of electrical stimulation, but also the use of photography, machine seeing, and the witnessing and capturing of fleeting attentions. So it's not just the fact that Duchenne kind of sits at the origins of the facial actual coding system, but it's also that interest and willingness to use new technologies to gauge expressions that I find interesting. So we find a real parallel between the 1870s, the 1880s, and I think where we are today. But there are differences. And the difference is that mediated empathy today, yes, it's done through technology as it was, but it's the automation element of this that I think is kind of particularly important. I think, yeah, I think in terms of kind of the quote on the screen here, again from the Emotional AI book, it says that the objective of all of this is nothing less than capacity to control, to engineer, to reshape, and modulate. And I think that modulate in terms of the ups and downs, and think back to that Boris Johnson slide in terms of trying to gauge, react, and again, modulate the emotionality of the UK population. I think this is important. But in terms of that kind of bottom underlying part, again, I think it's quite reasonable to assert that these technologies, again, are nothing less than the automation of consumer and industrial psychology. But this raises questions. These raises profound social questions. Is this okay? And I think, in short, it depends. It really does depend. So from my point of view, I kind of see real positives with these technologies, but I see scope for harms as well. But a few things kind of seem fairly clear to me. Is that one, everybody who's involved in kind of the ethics debate around these technologies needs to avoid moralizing about overall technology. So whether we're talking about affective computing, machine learning, whatever it might be, it makes absolutely no sense to moralize about overall technologies. I think as well, those of us in the ethics domain, we need to take on board that humans are imbricated in technical and data environments. And this isn't to kind of let kind of big tech companies off the hook. It's not to let bad practitioners off the hook. But I think we need to ensure those of us interested in ethical deployment of technologies are asking the right questions. And I think the place that we have to start with is that we live in extraordinary and highly datafied environments. So we do need to deal in specifics. So I think one way to approach this is through what Luciano Floridi speaks of in terms of soft as well as hard ethics. But what we do have to be careful here is that ethics are just not a nice to have. And the danger here is that ethics can be used as a smokescreen to avoid proper governance and regulation. The danger as I see it are that ethics are used to reduce regulation and reduce civic oversight. And these technologies will impact on citizens. And I think, Dubai, Smart Dubai, they're not the only outfit to make this point, to argue for lower regulation, to say that regulators don't have sufficient understanding of these technologies and that we have to let innovation run its course. Dubai are not the only organization to say this. But they are kind of certainly one of the global actors who say it most clearly. But yes, I think while self-regulation, it can work well in certain sectors. I don't think AI and I don't think emotionally enabled and AI is one of them. So yes, I prefer a soft ethics approach. I prefer an approach where we think about hard ethics in relation to law, and that's maintained, but also soft ethics as well. So soft ethics considers what ought to be done after and outside of compliance. And I think when we start to look at ethics this way around, that hard ethics in relation to kind of policy in relation to law, but soft ethics in relation to kind of cultural values around technologies and what ought to be done after compliance, I think this is a better route forward. And I think one of the things that surprised me in interviewing numerous kind of businesses, policymakers who are working in this area, is that there really is appetite for good regulation. And I think that might come as kind of slightly counterintuitive, but weirdly, in Silicon Valley, of all places, that was kind of one of the places where I found the keenest appetite, not just for good regulation, but for strong regulation as well. And for the simple reason is that it creates a level playing field. It sorts out the rules for those of us who are trying to innovate with these new technologies. And I think, it's important to consider the use cases as well. So I'm kind of just going to rattle through some use cases, but these are the ones that I've kind of been studying in my own work. Again, in terms of EdTech, I've been looking at it very closely in relation to children, in relation to law. I think it's just worth highlighting that we're not just talking about consumer experience. We're not just talking about advertising, marketing, and so on. We're talking about children and education. We're talking about borders and security. We're talking about policing and cities. And indeed, we're talking about advertising. And advertising, again, might kind of seem like a kind of a low bar example. And I think, to some extent, possibly it is compared to kind of border control. But we are talking about kind of the deployment of emotion sensing in public spaces within cities. And I think that really raises issues. Interestingly, Daniel, I think I must have pinned one of his images from somewhere. But the use of emotion sensing in workplaces, our workplaces, raises huge, profound ethical question, particularly around kind of issues of consent, and particularly around issues of coercion as well. And of course, while I'm sure there's very many well-meaning actors on this call, not everybody is quite so well-meaning. So and of course, I think social media data in politics as well. And although, this conference and this event is more about kind of biosensing and physiology, I don't think we should miss the impact that Cambridge Analytica and behavioral micro-targeting have had. And I'll come and talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but certainly in terms of kind of the research that I've been doing with UK citizens at a national level, they're more concerned about use of data from social media for political profiling than biometrics itself. And I find a staggering finding that UK citizens are more concerned about data scraped from social media to be used in political campaigning than biometrics. But that for me is a significant finding. But we've been talking about cars, and I suspect that other presenters will be talking about cars as well. So I just wanted to talk you through one of the questions that we asked UK citizens. So I asked just over 2,000 UK citizens this question, that car manufacturers are interested in understanding the emotional behavior of drivers. They want to do this to monitor fatigue and to lower distraction, to personalize driver experience, for example, by adjusting light, scent, sounds, and heating levels. Sensors will also detect stress, anger, or frustration. So I gave them a limited set of options, UK citizens, a limited set of options in terms of what best represents their feelings about this. So these were the options. They're able to say that they're not okay with data about their emotions being used in this way. So just not okay at all. Second option was that they're okay with this if the data doesn't go anywhere other than their car, their personal devices, and their phones. That means that the data stays with the individual, is not shared with any person or organization. Third option was that actually I'm okay with organizations collecting data about my emotions, but I would like that information to be anonymized. So no personal data and no personal information. And the fourth, I'm totally happy. I'm okay with data collection about my emotional state. I'm okay with this data to be linked with personal information held about me. They kind of let it all hang out option. And so these were the findings. And I think, what you should be able to see from the left in terms of the not okay, that comes in at around 45%. So it's 45% of people in the UK not okay with emotion sensing in cars in any way, shape or form. I think that kind of should really kind of give pause for thought to all of us kind of working and developing in this area. I should add as well that for other applications, be it in schools, be it in workplaces, be it in advertising, be it social media data and so on and so forth, the figure is actually higher than 40%. More than half of the people in the UK are not keen on these technologies at all. So I fully accept that surveys are not, they're not perfect. They're a very imperfect instrument. But I have kind of been polling. I've been running qualitative work in the UK for 5 years now on this. And, these attitudes do tend to be sticking. So, yeah, we can talk about kind of surveys and methods afterwards. But I think it's, for me, this is quite an important observation. So, yeah, so to end then, I think we've come a long way. So from British Enlightenment and kind of philosophies around fellow feeling, David Hume, and ideas about kind of empathy as the basis for moral life. But I think in terms of technologies as well, I think it's a useful kind of reminder that these technologies, they certainly might seem like the shiny new thing to many people on the call. But the idea, the principles, and in some cases, the technologies themselves are not that new. And I think, in a sense, we know for those of us perhaps on the call wondering, are these technologies going to stay? Are they going to stick? I think the fact that they've been with us for some time, I think means they have some way to go yet. But I think this issue of automation is key, this automation of industrial psychology. And in terms of kind of the ethical dimensions, yeah, is it okay? It really depends. But I think certainly kind of people in the UK are very wary. US and UK has a very similar profile in terms of technology usage and adoption of new technologies. So again, I think we can, yeah, it'd be interesting to think a bit more about the US. So I think, yeah, so in terms of those kind of working and developing this area, I think don't try to manage or socialize these technologies. I think to get people on board, you have to meaningfully engage. That involves kind of meaningful opting that gives people a meaningful choice. And I think change course as well. If citizens are just not keen on a particular application, change course and explore other approaches. But I will stop there because I think I'm out of time. But thank you very much. Second.
Thanks, Andy. So we do have time for a couple of questions. If you have a question, please enter it via Q&A or raise your hand in Zoom to be called on. We have a question in the chat from Cheryl Weiss and Cheryl asks, should we be better utilizing AI in regard to tracking COVID-19 spread? Should we be able to do so without consent?
In terms of COVID-19, is that about tracking emotion and sentiment in relation to COVID-19, or is that a contact tracing question?
Well, since Cheryl's not voice enabled, I will just say that contact tracking, including via mobile devices that most of us carry, almost all of us carry around, is very relevant. But I could see where emotion tracking would be in play as well. And Cheryl does say both. Yes.
Yeah, so I think on the emotion side of things, yeah, we're developing work and we're working with some companies in the UK to develop kind of apps and services in this regard. And we see a real opportunity here in terms of to take a temperature check, a regular temperature check of the mood of the nation, of the mood of the UK, but the app is very much an opt-in service. We did consider going down the line. Yes, of course, you could just scrape down you could scrape data from social media, and that will give you kind of a rough approximation. But we think that an opt-in and potentially even kind of video-based service is the way to go. So yeah, we're thinking through this at the moment, but very much opt-in. In relation to the contact tracing question, yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I mean, the situation where the UK is at the moment is whether we have a centralized model or whether we go for a decentralized model, working with kind of Google and Apple. In terms of whether, yeah, that's opt-in or opt-out, personally, I'm happy to do it. And if, but yeah, but as to whether that's that should stand for, I'm not so sure.
All right, do we have other questions for Andy? I see one via the Q&A feature. Guru Venkat asks, is federated learning the solution to the ethics issues, but will it work well for emotional AI?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
So Guru Venkat asks, is federated learning the solution to the ethics issues? We'll have to decide what federated learning refers to. Will it work well for emotional AI?
I think there's something to be said for processing locally on people's devices. I think that is going to get around many of the issues here.
All right, do we... Presmek Kazyanka, who will be speaking later, asks, do you not think it is only a problem of data itself, or maybe rather reasoning possibilities? For example, derivation of emotions from the text I wrote.
Sorry, can you read the question out again?
Okay, take a look at the chat to see it yourself. Do you not think it is only a problem of data itself, or maybe rather reasoning possibilities?
Yeah, so, well, no. No, I don't. So I don't think it's a problem of data. So presumably we are talking about, yeah, emotion here. No, emotion and data, data is about something, and it's about something that's very important. So data itself isn't neutral when it's about something. So I think that thing in which it refers to is very important.
Okay, and one more entered via Q&A from Jacqueline Gordon. For what uses were our citizens okay with keeping information related to themselves potentially available? For instance, health information in case of emergencies, versus never okay to share beyond your own devices? That's a big question.
Yeah, in relation to health, I haven't asked health questions yet. Interesting, we have looked at in relation to children, but that's more of a kind of a parental consent issue. Yeah, so unfortunately, when it comes to kind of health info in case of emergencies, yeah, I haven't asked that question, but I will.
All right, well, thanks, Andy. We're going to stop there. Thank you for your presentation.